Everyone, welcome back to Manufacturing Hub. If you guys are watching us live, it's a Wednesday afternoon or a Thursday morning if you're in Australia. If you guys are listening at some point that is not live, who really knows what day of the week it is? I'm really excited. Vlad and I are really excited to have Logan on, who we're going to go introduce in just a couple of minutes to go talk about change management. Change management is one of those topics that I suppose just kind of live with all of us, right? Like it is something that if you are part of any sort of organization, or if you're part of, a group of probably more than one person being yourself, there is the need of change management day in, day out throughout our entire lives. I am not sure that there is one single topic that has been brought up in more conversations in the history of Manufacturing Hub other than change management, either in name or, hey, this is a problem we have, or, hey, this is a project that we've gone and done and we've had to go through X, Y, and Z steps in order to be successful. And so I am happy to go ahead and dig into it with Logan. Vlad has an entire change management theme that we are trying to go ahead and do, but we absolutely want your thoughts. So if you guys are here for change management, either thoughts, recommendations, tips, if you've got questions for Logan or Vlad or myself, please feel free to go ahead and ask those. Having said that, if you guys are new here, welcome. If you've been here before, welcome back. If you're new here, every Wednesday, Vlad and I get to go have an awesome conversation with the fantastic practitioners, very similar to Logan here, about interesting topics all across automation and manufacturing and industrial. So having said that, without further ado, everyone officially welcome to Manufacturing Hub. My name is Dave Griffith. This guy up here is Vlad Romanov. Our guest, Logan, joins us as a co-director of digital transformation from LSI, episode 259. Logan, officially welcome to the show. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Dave. Happy to be here. Thanks, Vlad.
Absolutely, Logan. Thank you so much for taking the time. Before we dive into the conversation on change management, could you give us an overview of your background? How did you get into the industrial automation manufacturing space? Talk to us a little bit about your career and ultimately what you are doing today as well at LSI.
Yeah, of course. Well, I started my career just about 15 years ago. I'm a mechanical engineer by degree, but immediately after university got into industrial automation. Spent about 10 years doing PLC programming, HMI, SCADA development with a large systems integrator in North America. After that, I spent a couple of years doing digital transformation consultancy, where we focused on things as business problems rather than technology problems. And it was a large mental shift for me at that time, and really opened my eyes to how you actually solve problems with technology as a lever, but not the only lever. Since November 2024, I've been over at LSI, co-directing the digital transformation practice here, where we really focus on advanced SCADA and above. So advanced SCADA functionality through MES functionality, data and analytics, higher level integrations with business intelligence applications. And for those of you who aren't familiar with LSI, we're a rather large multinational systems integrator. We have about 400 resources across North America. We operate out of 13 North American locations and a few offices in the Asia Pacific area as well.
Logan, a couple of questions for you based on the background, right? So you've mentioned having a degree in mechanical engineering, right? So I'm curious maybe as to why and how you made the switch into the industrial automation space. Was that purposeful? Did you start with something on the mechanical side? Could you paint us a better picture, please?
Yeah. It was an interesting switch, but through my internships through university, focused purely on mechanical problems, I felt a little bit left out when I was looking at how do you actually make these mechanical systems come alive, and they come alive through automation, and that is really the interface between the physical and the digital world. And at least to me, my opinion, that's where the magic happens. So what didn't take long, and I got a great opportunity at a university to start with a systems integrator, and I never really looked back to the purely mechanical world. Although I do feel that education has benefited me throughout my career as well, with having that physical understanding of how machines work and physically collaborate with each other, which has influenced a lot of the decisions that I've made through my automation career as well.
Interesting. Let me ask you a second follow-up along the same train of thought, right? So obviously as a systems engineer or control systems engineer, when you start your career, early on, you have a couple of paths, right? And I would maybe define them as going to an end user, working at a plant, going to work for an SI. You can work at a machine builder and probably like an OEM, right, that distributes and sell parts. I'm curious, like looking back, because I started at an end user and worked in plants for a chunk of my career. Looking back at the SI experience, maybe how did that, how would I say, like shape your career today? Did you get exposed to a lot of different industries, different projects? Were you focused on the vertical, right? Could you unpack that for someone earlier in their career?
Yeah. I think one of the great things about working for an SI is the diversity in what you get to focus your time and effort into, right? No project you do is, well, rarely any project is the same, exactly the same, but also different industry exposure. So when I was, doing PLC programming, I did primarily food and beverage and CPG. So I got a lot of experience with process control, both liquid and physical process control. But also, through the later stages of my tenure there, I got a lot of exposure into pharmaceutical and biopharma space, which is an entirely different ballgame when it comes to change management, for one, for sure, which is a good segue into our topic today. But I think that diversity, seeing how many different clients operate and how they manage change and how they manage their process control, gives you a good diverse perspective on what is good and what is bad. And good doesn't always look the same for everyone. So having that diversity, I think, helps as an SI going to recommend or make suggestions to a prospective or a new client as well.
Absolutely. And maybe again, to your point on transitioning towards change management, right? I want to recognize that it's usually not an early career type of a topic. I think that as I would say like 1 to 5 years out of school engineer, you're very focused on learning the technology, the solutions, but then you start to notice gaps in either process or personnel or how those projects are executed. So maybe could you paint that picture for someone who may not have that context, right? What are some of the signs maybe of good or bad change management, but also ultimately define what it is for someone who is unfamiliar with what it may stand for?
Yeah. Maybe I'll start with at least my definition of change
Mhm.
management, and then I'll segue from there into some of the scenarios that I've seen and been able to learn through.
Sure. Mhm.
So I think, ultimately change management, to really kind of boil it down to one or two sentences, is a systematic or methodical approach to managing the transition of either an individual or teams of individuals or a system or an organization as a whole from wherever they are current state to wherever they're going future state. And I think I've maybe said that hopefully generically enough that it applies to many different scenarios, but the actual system or methodology that you apply is drastically dictated by the actual transition that's upcoming, right? I think ultimately in the, let's call it in the automation space, what that maybe means more specific to this conversation is, let's say you're an SI or you're a controls engineer and you're designing a system that humans need to interface, and it maybe plays into an existing or a non-existing business process that may integrate with it in some capacity. However you design the system and you define the system to be, it's ultimately the process of ensuring that long term the facility actually operates with that process in mind, right? And they're not trying to deviate from it or find shortcuts or bypass the process overall, right? How do you make
Mhm.
that sustained change?
And let me ask you one, I guess, like brief follow up before I pass it over to Dave. You've also obviously you've mentioned digital transformation, which is part of your title at LSI. Could you again like paint a clear or a clearer, I would say, like interface between digital transformation and change management? Is change management as a result of digital transformation? Is it a byproduct? How would you maybe put the two together?
Yeah, I would say in digital transformation, that's a very monolithic term, right? It means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But for our focus areas, right, where we're focusing on advanced SCADA, where I'm talking more kind of dashboarding, detailed analytics, trending capabilities, where you're trying to make decisions based on the information that's being presented, through MES for sure, right? All of the
Yep.
different suites of functions in MES, because MES is so tightly tied to business process and how people go do their work day to day. And ultimately, I feel that the closer you get to to applications that the closer applications get to the act of making a decision, the more influence or focus on change management you need for that. I think MES is probably, and I think many people would agree, change management in MES is probably one of the hardest components of a successful MES project and an unsuccessful MES project.
Absolutely. Dave, thoughts?
Yeah, Vlad, you're over here just really asking the easy questions. I'm sure Logan really and the listeners really appreciate you just easing Logan into the questions. But no, I think both of you brought up some really good points when it comes to change management and how one comes into change management. If you want, I guess I want to expand upon that a bit for the listeners. I guess in my thoughts, when you're a young engineer, when you're into kind of any part of industry, you almost come into change management unintentionally, right? Like, so unless you're somehow get hired directly into a CID, a continuous improvement team, in which case they are probably going to have strong definitions and strong processes to change management, you're almost certainly going to come into change management because you have a problem, because you found a solution that at least you believe solves the problem. As to if it does or not, as to if the organization has gone through this or not, several dozen times is completely irrelevant. But you're going to have a solution to a problem that you believe is true. And then you're going to go present this, and you're probably just going to be flat out told no, right? And if you're not flat out told no, it probably becomes now I have to go figure out how to sell this thought and idea upstream to the managers and directors and above. And then I also have to go sell this thought out kind of wide within my engineering or operations team, and then kind of cross engineering and operations team, et cetera, to go convince them that we need to go down this process. And at least for me, that is the early stages of learning what change management was and the struggles of change management. And to Logan's point, I feel like we talk about change management so much because of how difficult it is, right? If there was a singular definition and a singular path forward as to this is change management and this is how we go convince everyone that change management is correct and best for the organization, it would be much simpler, right? But then we add in the fact that there are humans, and humans have different motivating factors. And sometimes they are internal, and lots of times they are external motivating factors. And then it becomes okay, how do we do change management at this facility? And then is it this facility or this vertical similar or different than the 100 or 1,000 other facilities and verticals that someone with a consultant hat or a systems integrator hat is going to sit with? So in my experience, it becomes very difficult. And Logan, I think you just said it, especially like on MES projects and MES solutions. It is very much the kind of defining factor, the pivot point, if you will, of will this project be successful or will this project not be successful? And I have certainly seen way too many groups, both on the end user side and on the systems integrator side, walk into this path, and no one has even really considered the concept of change management, right? Like, way too many times the systems integrator is like, I'm going to go deliver this solution, and I'm going to hit the specifications and requirements, and then I'm going to go hand it over, and it's just going to work because this is how it was designed. And way too often, the end user doesn't necessarily think about all the change management that they have to go through, because many times, a MES scale style project, similar to an ERP scale style project, is something people do once in their career within an organization, right? So unless the knowledge comes in from outside of the organization, there's very little chance that internally the organization is going to have the knowledge that we even need to do this in order to be successful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you hit on something there that hit close to home, which is the unknowingly stumbling into the requirement of change management, because I think, I doubt that we're alone in that. I feel there's, probably a lot of listeners that have unknowingly stumbled into that as well. But, myself, an engineer, right, when I got out of school, I was focused on making technically perfect solutions, right? And I wanted them to function perfectly based on the requirements, perform all of the features that they needed to perform, and ensure that we got through ultimately, an FAT or an SAT without a hitch, right? But that's only half the story, right? As soon as you involve people, people are no longer predictable by algorithms or mathematical equations or technology in general. You start to have to, pull on the internal psychologist inside yourself to understand what is the behavioral psychology of the people, the stakeholders that are going to be impacted by this change. And of course, there's people who have PhDs in this subject who would know a lot better than me, but just having consideration on that topic, on how this will impact people's day-to-day workflow, how does this impact their emotional state, all of those things, just that slight consideration into that can often solve a lot of problems before you're in the 11th hour of commissioning and you find out it's not going to work for the operations team.
Absolutely. I guess I've got some questions for Logan, but I feel like we hit on a really good topic. Vlad, I feel like you're like holding yourself back. Do you have thoughts you want to go add to this topic?
Well, I think the interesting thought, Dave, that you've mentioned, right, which I will formulate into a question for Logan, is the fact that there is rarely a delineation between an end user and an SI of who's going to be responsible for change management once the project is completed, right? And one could argue both sides, saying that once there is a scope of project on the technical side, there is little incentive to execute more than just deploying this in the field and walking away and letting the end user handle whatever is again, like, to handle within their organization. But on the flip side, again, there is a level maybe of responsibility that if the project fails for other reasons other than technical, then even your organization would look bad, right? So I guess maybe a question for Logan is, where have you seen those lines sort of fall? Is it same as Dave has mentioned, pretty rare? Does it fall on the SI, or is there some ownership that has fallen on the SI as far as change management goes?
Yeah, I think, I mean, that's a great question. I think if we were to look at when a project fails because of change management traditionally, right, I think there's blame to place on both parties, the service provider who designed and implemented the solution, as well as the end user who, was unsuccessful at maintaining that application long term, or extracting the value out of it that they intended to extract, right? And coming from an SI perspective, there's a lot of scenarios where we're working with a client and there was a scope request and we quoted the exact scope and implemented that exact scope to the T, right? And it's unsuccessful because we didn't have that forethought or foresight to work in some of these design choices that would have improved the end user's ability to adopt that and successfully implement that type of application or change, right? But to give the SI some credit too, in the world of competitive RFPs and RFQs and all of that, price is always a determining factor in who's awarded and not awarded those types of projects. And rarely have I seen an RFP that has included proper change management design and development for the scope that was requested, right? So in a situation like that, there is not a lot of benefit to the systems integrator to add that in if it's not been requested. Now, of course, I think SIs do have the responsibility to call out risk when there's risk, right? Regardless of what's in the scope and what's out of the scope. And I think those who don't have or who don't put in the time to think about the post-deployment, post-implementation phase of this and what that could result in and how that could influence the success of a project, are doing themselves a disservice. Because ultimately, if a project fails because a client has failed to adopt it, that still, at the end of the day, impacts the reputation of the services provider, right? And at the services providers are built off of their reputation.
Yeah, and it's a very, I find, like, different, or I guess difficult challenge to crack, right? And putting myself back in the shoes of the end user, I have very rarely seen benchmarks for, again, submitted bids, whether that's proposals or quotes, that were basically marked down apples to apples, meaning that, let's take something as simple as training post installation, right? And you could extract that and quantify what is the dollar amount attributed to such an exercise, which is going to result in a successful deployment of that specific system in an organization, right? It's going to be very rarely done as such, and it's only going to be just the total dollars compared to your point on who's going to win that project. Therefore, you're almost disincentivized to add a lot of those components that may be perceived as risky by the end user. It is a very, very difficult challenge. I guess how have you navigated some of those conversations in the past? How have you maybe convinced or sold to the end user that there is necessity to have those conversations?
I think ultimately it just comes down to having the conversation, right? If you can air your concerns and talk through some of the things that you think need additional consideration within the bid process, right? A lot of the times I think the bid process is handled on the end user side without a whole lot of consideration to that post-implementation phase as well, right? Their main goal is to execute this project and get the project implemented. It's not intentional that it's left out. I think there just maybe hasn't been enough thought put into what should be included in a change management line item, let's say. So just having the conversation, I think, is really the best we can do. And if that resonates with the end user, hopefully they'll either amend the RFP or they'll see that inclusion in a line item as not a cost adder or a cost inflation line item, but rather a valid inclusion to have in a submitted scope, right?
Absolutely. And to add to what you're saying, Logan, I feel like it is most difficult in the attempted one-to-one bids where the only thing that matters is the dollar value and going and talking about change management. I guess having said that, in my experience, most of the groups who are, call them, I don't know, Fortune 2000, Fortune 5000, are going to have some sort of training program, are going to have a train the trainer style program, are going to have at least an idea and an understanding that change management is needed. As to how successful they are or not is different. Having said that, in my experience, the best projects are the ones that start the change management process as we are collecting scope and specifications, right? It's the how are people using the tools currently? How can we go make changes and modifications to the tools that we are going to go specify? And if we're going to go bid it out, we'll go bid it out. If we're not going to go specify it, or if we're not going to go bid it out, then we can go bring someone in to go do the initial groundwork so that we can be the most successful. When you have the pre-bid, then the RFP or the RFIs to get some feedback for an RFP to then go and take all of that and change it and kind of continue down the path. That makes it very difficult. And as you were saying, Logan, if someone sends in a bid and I bid $10 and Vlad is exceptionally much more thoughtful than Dave is, and he's like, it would cost me $9.50 to go do this work, but I think it's going to be 2.5 times the work because of all of this hypercare and the after and the training and the change management, and he bids $25, he's hardly ever going to go win a competitive bid process because he is that much more expensive, even though he adds it in, which makes those kind of one-to-one, it makes them very difficult, right? Like the best ones that I've seen are like, you have to have these line items. These are the line items we're accepting. Please put all of your budget under these line items. And again, go call out as much risk as one possibly can. But when I go call out risk in bid situations like that as the consultant or as the integrator, it's almost, how do I say it? It's almost to go cover myself of saying, hey, we've noticed there are these glaring gaps in this potential project. We're letting you know that there are these gaps. Hopefully we'll be able to go ahead and identify and remediate these as we move through this. But please know you're missing all of these things that will go make the project successful. And I agree to the previous parts of the conversation. Those are exceptionally important and needed. I guess let's slowly transition away from that and go talk about, so Logan, you're sitting in, co-director of digital transformation and an integrator right now. I guess let's say that there's a blank slate, that there's a new client that comes in and says, hey, we want to do this project. How do you go start bringing up those concepts and those conversations of change management? What do those initial processes look through? What would maybe best practices, best case scenario of a project at a very high level look like for you?
Yeah. So, let's kind of talk through maybe a hypothetical situation or a very real situation. You have this new client comes to you and asks you to say, I want to create a dashboarding application that, visualizes KPIs for a production line or for a facility, right? But the real intention of that is not just so they can see how well or how poorly they're running, right? They ultimately want to be able to use that information to make decisions to affect or impact change to how well or how poorly they are running. And that's ultimately where the conversation needs to start, right? Is what are the decisions that you want to be able to make with this application, and what workflows will be involved with making those decisions? And I think too often as an engineer or as an SI, often these problems are approached with, well, what historian do you want to use, or what is the database schema going to look like, and all of these really, like, I would say, nuts and bolts components of building an application. And that, if you start with that conversation right off the bat, you're skipping the most important pieces of putting together a concept or a design for what this will ultimately look like. If you start with what are the decisions that need to be made and what are the workflows that need to be involved, and then expand from that, do a bit of a fishbone analysis on all of those different components, then you really start to understand, and you get into conversations about how company operates, what's the culture like, what's the information sharing, how seamless is information sharing and discussions had between the different stakeholder groups or the different departments that are involved. All of those sort of soft things that are not hard technical requirements become almost the most important requirements for building an application that's going to ultimately help an end user make better, faster, smarter decisions. And that is where we start with these conversations to say, okay, if you want to be able to do these things with this application, this is the scope that we need to build in, and this is the design process that we need to follow to ensure that we're staying aligned from concept through to implementation and ultimately through adoption.
Interesting. Do you have, I guess I'm assuming that you're using some kind of a templatized process to get this done? You have something that is like refined and you can replicate from customer to customer, or is it very kind of like tailor-made for each application?
I wish we had a silver bullet for these, but unfortunately, just by the nature of how organizations are so unique from one another, how the decision-making process differs between even departments within an organization, but certainly between facilities or disparate companies for that matter, until you kind of define those components, it's really, really hard to find a one-size-fits-all. It's more of a methodology than it is a systemic approach.
Gotcha. And I guess just so I understand your approach a little bit better, how deep does this maybe process go, right? I'm assuming for a smaller application, you can probably spend a couple of days with the customer. For something a little bit larger, would involve multiple groups. Like, could you paint us a picture of what this hypothetically would entail generally?
Yeah. So for a smaller dashboarding application, let's say you're creating, a line overview or an operator dashboard for the work center that they're stationed at, right? Those types of things, typically you can define the requirements, the soft requirements for, within a day or two in working with those stakeholders, right? And I would almost say in almost all cases, we like to do kind of the Gemba walk, right? Where you're on site, you're seeing where the operator is actually interfacing, what decisions they're making in real time, and how they, go about their tasks. Because all of that's going to influence how the design of said dashboard or interface needs to be put together. When it comes to larger implementations, let's say, a larger track and trace system or, a yield optimization system that you're designing that ties into inventory management or warehouse management or procurement or supply chain or all of these things that could be, involved, then it becomes a lot more difficult because it's not just one workflow anymore. It's 7 or 8 workflows that all have touch points with each other. And the more workflows, the more decisions, the more people involved, the longer that process takes. So, some of the we've been involved with very complex applications that are implemented, and we spend weeks just doing that workflow definition to define those the requirements for the soft requirements outside of the technology components.
Let me ask you a follow-up on that side, right? So traditionally, right, again, based on our earlier conversation, I would argue that SIs typically had a very technical, finite scope of work, right? Once we start talking about digital transformation, which, we've discussed a little bit earlier, I think it's an ongoing process in almost every case, right? You're seeing your customer as a partner over the long run versus here's a finite project. Once it's done, it's sort of done. So I'm curious, as far as the skill sets go when it comes to maybe change management, right? Are you now staffing individuals who are also equally skilled on the technical side as they are with talking and having some of these conversations with organizations? Do you sometimes maybe supplement from the outside? How does that, again, like going back to the interaction that you've described, I'm curious how the skill sets within an SI fit into those conversations.
Yeah, well, I can speak for LSI, right?
Mhm.
And I can speak to my, I think, opinion or my perception
Yeah.
of some of the maybe the gaps that I've seen with other services providers in the space. So at LSI, you're absolutely right. Digital transformation is not an end; it's not a destination, right? It's kind of an ongoing journey. So you're never just performing some design and development of a change management strategy for a specific skid that you're deploying and automating, right? Where there is a more cut and dry end date for when this goes in and when it will be fully operational and fully adopted. With digital transformation, you're constantly in flux because business requirements are changing all of the time. The market landscape is changing. They're introducing new product lines, whatever that might be. It's constantly in flux. So you're always in a state of considering change management. And it definitely does change, I would say, the staffing requirements that SIs have if you want to play or participate in those types of ongoing really side-by-side partner journeys with your clients, right? You need to have people who are call them consultants, but some people don't like the term consultants, but they are individuals who will talk through all of these components and ask the questions that the end user themselves may not have thought of yet, and bring in experience from 10 or 20 different failed initiatives and 10 or 20 successful initiatives that are tangential to what you're trying to do. Bringing all of that experience and just talking that out with the end user is very, very valuable. It allows us to bring, the expertise that the client themselves may not have been exposed to in the past, right? So we certainly have resources like that in-house. But then we also have our technical resources as well that are building the applications behind the scenes to the requirements that are being set upfront and ongoing changes by our consultant level resources. But there are also firms, I know for sure, we've partnered with a few in the past that specialize in behavioral psychology in an industrial setting. And depending on the level of change, I would consider if you're doing a net new ERP implementation or a rip and replace of an ERP, you would almost every time need more management level consultants to help you through that process, because there is no more change that you can impact on a manufacturing facility or organization than ripping out their ERP and putting in a new one.
I agree. I think it would be difficult to go affect a more substantial change. Having said that, most like medium, even some of the larger manufacturing facilities I've worked with, Logan, they're like, man, this ERP implementation is going to be really expensive. So we're going to go attempt to save money by just, quote, adopting whatever best standards the ERP groups say we should use. And we'll just go change all of our internal things in order to go save some not insignificant amount of money when it comes to custom and bespoke changes in coding within the ERP. Man, I have never seen, I've seen very few projects that easily last 7 to 10 years before they either implement or don't implement. Those are always very long projects. You brought up an interesting point talking about behavioral science and behavioral experts. I guess we've dug into some of the technical side, right? So we've dug into the technical side. We've dug into the calling out risks or potential risks. But when it comes to change management, there is a huge amount of the human side. So we can either walk through an example or maybe talk about how from your perspective, I guess your perspective as the consultant slash systems integrator, are you actively in there attempting to go work with the operators and operations staff and everyone on that side in order to go do some of these changes? Are you calling out and attempting to go work with a hopefully existing group of people in charge of change management internally? What does that process look like for you guys?
Yeah, one of the first questions when we get into these types of engagements with our clients, we ask them is, what is your change management or CI practice look like internally, right? Because ultimately, if they don't have a self-sufficient CI group that can sustain this change, it's rarely going to be successful long term. We are not in the business of, we don't want to force ourselves upon our clients and say that your success it lives or dies by our participation in this engagement, right? We want to be able to deploy solutions that our clients can maintain, expand, manage, modify in perpetuity once we're out of the equation, right? And without proper CI practices internally, that's really, really hard to do. And we're completely happy supporting our clients through that, but we much prefer when they can become self-sufficient in that area. So that's one of the first questions we'll ask, and that adds a certain level of risk to what is the likelihood of success to an engagement. But when we are in alignment with their ability to take on a change management strategy that we have potentially developed in collaboration with them throughout the design and development phase of the project, then almost always there's a bit of a handoff or a post-implementation phase after commissioning happens, after the trainer sessions have happened, and after we've done our touch points with them 30, 60, 90 days afterwards to ensure that the application or the product or solution is being used the way it was intended to be used, and there's not modifications that need to be made to ensure a higher level of adoption. Then we start to hand that plan over to the client to start to manage longer term. I would say there's varying levels of that, again, depending on the intricacy or the complexity of whatever application it is that you're building. But it almost always follows that sort of that sequence, I would say, of approach.
Okay. I like that. I guess I want to go talk about some examples, some successes, some failures. I feel like we all learn more from failures than successes. I know my failures have certainly traumatized me much more than my successes stay with me. Having said that, I want to go dig into what you mentioned, right? So Logan, best case scenario, medium to large size organization. And I imagine most of the groups that LSI works with are of the medium to large size or organizations, just because the size of LSI. So medium to large size organization hopefully has some change management. What if there's been some turnover? What if they don't have that change management internal? What does that process look like? Do you guys work with them in order to go find someone to be that internal change management person? Is it maybe we're not ready to go down this path? Let's go figure out what the foundational steps are for the end user first. What does that look like if they're not ready and not actively doing change management?
Yeah, so we have certainly consulted with organizations and made recommendations for how they could either replenish or build a CI team, right, to handle ongoing change management. We are not management consultants, so we are not in the pure change management consulting space where that's we would come in and do that and then walk away. We provide change management as what we believe is a necessity for people implementing projects of this type, as a value add for our clients, right? So typically, maybe the analogy I bring is more of like the design build, right? Design build firms rarely do design on its own. They design solutions to then build. That's kind of the scenario that we approach our clients and our engagements with as well. So depending on, I would say, for lack of a better answer, it depends, right? Depending on the state they're in, we would either recommend that you bring in another firm that specializes in organizational management, or if it's really they've lost a key stakeholder who was the champion for this solution that we deployed, then certainly we would come in and help bridge that gap until they found an appropriate replacement for managing or championing that change.
Absolutely.
Let me
It's always
jump in. Let me jump in, Dave, for a moment. Just wanted to ask Logan a follow up on that side, right? So I think the three of us agree that there needs to be a foundational baseline for the capability of change management. at the very least as the necessity for success of the technical projects, right? And I think we've also identified, I would say, almost like two paths to getting there, one of which is joining a CI team, or number two, just trial by fire, right? You failed so many times that you've now recognized, well, maybe this is a skill that I should acquire. I'm curious, Logan, like as you maybe hire individuals, interview individuals, and assess them on that side of things, what would you recommend, or how would you recommend them to sort of bridge the gap from their technical expertise, but now also being able to serve the client on this change management side?
Yeah. So let me see. Let me think about this. For as far as when we're looking for talent, right? One of the questions, well, maybe I'll phrase it with an example. Instead of asking, if you were going to build this type of solution, how would you build it, right? I would rephrase the question to say, if we were tasked with implementing this type of solution, how would the client use it, and what benefit would they gain from it? And that type of approach, I think, can be applied to automation projects as well, where instead of asking about how would you program this complex sequence, is how does this complex sequence affect everything around it, right? It's something I always recommend to people who ask for career advice as well, is, what is the number one thing that I can be doing in the space to advance my career or my professional experience? And it's, don't just think about the system, right? Think about how a facility or an organization operates. Consider how procurement happens, how maintenance happens, and the workflows that go into that. How engineering and design influences the operations teams. Think about all of these different things holistically, rather than just tunnel vision on the specific system that you've been tasked to work with. Because that holistic thought process, I think, is one of the critical pieces that the industry at large would benefit from more experts in.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Dave? I know you had follow-ups for Logan.
So I was going to thank Logan for his really specific and good examples. Sadly, sometimes the best answer is it depends. And so I would agree. I would agree with that. And I like your concept of trying to go understand the value that it brings to the system. I would agree. I think to some extent it's important. It's important for lots of resources to understand how to go build something, right? And the build something could be a SCADA solution. The build something could be a bunch of Excel macros on the finance side, or how to go integrate something to QuickBooks. Like, it's important to be able to, for many people, technically build something. The much more valuable skill is understanding how everything works within the organization, and the value that what you've created, how that applies to the organization, and then honestly to go ahead and go elevate that to other parts of the staff and other parts of the executive leadership, so that they understand, which in and of itself is a not insignificant part of change management. Logan, you talked about some successes, you talked about some failures. Do you have an example, or maybe a couple of examples of failures, or a failure and a couple of successes, inclusive of change management? Those are always some of the most fun parts of these conversations.
Yeah, definitely have a number of failures, or unsuccessful stories. I have a number of successful ones too, but I think the ones that you can glean the most from are learning from other people's misfortune. So I'll go over a couple of examples there. One of them, number of years ago, building an application that was, again, going back to my earlier example, KPI tracking for a line in this scenario. It was doing throughput, uptime, downtime tracking, and some dashboarding. Technically, I thought it was perfect. We had all of the requirements. Commissioning FAT, SAT was a huge success. We implemented, we did train the trainer sessions, we walked away. Thought we were done. Went in maybe 6 to 9 months later for another engagement at the same facility, and all of the terminals at that line for displaying this dashboard were shut off. You raised the question, well, when did these get shut off? Oh, I don't know, a few months ago. They were just never turned back on, right? And that hurts as an engineer who thought he designed something really beautiful and technically sound. to know that they were no longer using it because somebody turned it off and they never needed to turn it back on, is a clear indicator that somewhere along the design development process, something broke, right? And we did a postmortem at that point too. We really wanted to understand how we could improve for a redo or a retry. Where did this go wrong? And ultimately, it was because two main things. One, we never involved maintenance into the design process. It was an entire workflow that we didn't have a whole lot of consideration for because the requirement was to use these sensors to track throughput. Well, when that sensor is a photo eye and maintenance has a workflow where if that photo eye goes out, they don't care because it doesn't affect the actual production of the widget. It often takes a long time to get that replaced when there's 1,000 other fires going on of higher priority. So in the periods where those photo eyes were out, well, their throughput calculations for performance and yield were, non-existent. So one, the system wasn't designed with that consideration in mind. Obviously, if that workflow would have been considered heavily, there would have been some additional thought into, okay, well, how can we provide an easy way for reconciling those automatically, totalized production counts through that line, so that even when that photo eye is down, they still have the ability to either manually enter or reconcile the values that they're seeing, right? Pretty easy fix. It was just something we hadn't thought about at the time. And I think, as we all know, as soon as you lose the trust of a few stakeholders that are using an application, it's the easiest thing to break and the hardest thing to build. And once trust is lost in an application, people go back to using spreadsheets. And that's exactly what the client did in this scenario. But the other piece that we missed too, which I think is a little bit more difficult to identify and work into the design process, was the behavioral impact that we didn't consider for the operators that had these new dashboards, right? It was an OEE dashboard, basically. We knew that their OEE was low as we were designing this. We knew it was going to display low numbers. But turns out when you put, a 30% score in front of people for OEE, it doesn't really motivate them because they don't feel like they can do much to increase that by any material value, right? And so what we took from that is, again, another easy change that can be made is if you're running at 30% and your target's 36% because you have a long way to go, you're not going to set a target of 90% when you're running 30% day in and day out. But if you're running 30% and your target's 36%, well, you just change your calculation there for what you're displaying to your plant floor staff. Instead of showing 30%, you now show 80%. You're running at 80% of your target. It's a much more motivating number, and that factors into the whole behavioral science and behavioral psychology component around positive and negative reinforcement and what behaviors that drives on the plant floor, which is a huge piece of change management, in my opinion.
Absolutely. I can't tell you how many times I have gone and looked at some of those OEE KPIs and seen no one's been tracking it, right? So we don't know how bad it is, and it's like 14%, 26%. Very infrequently are people cracking 30% if they're not going through the process of previously having measured or calculating that. And it's not necessarily anyone's fault. To that point, Logan, very few things are more demoralizing than when there's a big board and everyone feels like they're doing great. They just had record numbers and they're like, oh, we were just running at 14%. And the boss wants to get to 85%, and our best effort got us to 14%. Why should we even bother trying anymore? So I would completely agree with that. Having said that, sometimes I've seen other facilities kind of obfuscate those numbers and that poor performance as they are going, and kind of directing that upwards to the executives to say, oh no, we're actually running at 80%, or we're actually running at 92% because we are looking for 36 and we're actually running at 30, that sort of thing. And that's where sometimes those numbers become a bit more difficult as we go through. Vlad, have you ever run into a project where you presented people with how poorly they're running and they all just got up and walked out?
I had OE. I've done many OE implementations in food and bev, and I would say I had very mixed experiences depending on the site, right? And maybe the most peculiar realization, right, to keep it a little bit short, was that there are sites that will, manipulate and obfuscate some of those numbers, upon which there are bonus structures, as you can imagine, quarterly or yearly. And so the people that have that workflow or capability are very reluctant to change for that reason, right? So the typical engineer would want a system that cannot be manipulated, that is, how would I say it, like data correct, or data exact, so to speak. But again, the human nature is such that they want these strange features, and will basically fail the project as a result of no longer having that control. And again, if you haven't seen it, if you haven't lived through it, it's very hard to picture that that is what is happening on the plant floor. But I've certainly, again, I've seen groups that are, again, to Dave's point, maybe delusional to the extent of thinking that they can change very rapidly just as a result of having the metrics. And that is very rarely the case. And someone has to break it to them that the groups that have achieved 85% OEE are the ones that have established not only the analytics, the data, but also the culture, the approach, the trainers, right? There's a whole slew of different other factors. So it is a very interesting factor, I would say. But like I said, for me, the most kind of astonishing witness was of this instance where, again, they really wanted that feature of being able to change the numbers, right? And obviously I can get in the details, but you can get the picture of how that can be done.
Yeah, and I think there's a pragmatic approach that you can take to the obfuscation that you put on the data, right? And depending on the culture, which is the #1 driver for why you make decisions on what you show where within an organization, right? Depending on that culture, you make decisions to, do that in areas only when it makes sense to drive the right behaviors, right? Which ultimately, 1,000 good behaviors on the plant floor versus 100 good behaviors is going to drive a better outcome, right? So you want to go for every opportunity you can to drive the right behavior.
Yeah, and I would say, like, Logan, like, the story was really good, right? And I think it illustrates, or at least like my biggest takeaway is, if there's no champion within that specific customer that will continue to drive the value of the solution. And to your point, again, it's hard to figure out who is to blame, whether, you needed to have investigated more on the maintenance side, or they should have internally flagged that as a risk and realized, that champion within a CI or operations needed to have those conversations, is of course difficult to say. But again, in my experience, if there is not that one single owner that will drive the execution from the customer standpoint, it is very likely to, again, like in a broader sense, fail, right? So it is interesting to hear these postmortems as well, right? I learned a thing or two, and as I've mentioned a little bit earlier, if you haven't gone through those experiences, I almost start to question, where could you find this type of information, right? I don't think there's any books, or at least that I have seen, written on these deployments, right? So super interesting. Appreciate it.
Yeah, I would agree. I don't think the maintenance part is necessarily a your issue. I think that could have been flagged, should have been identified when it first happened, as opposed to, hey, it got turned off several months ago and we never said anything, because it probably would have been a very minor tweaks to go solve those problems. And all projects have unforeseen issues that take a little bit of effort and a little bit of tweaking as you go through that. I have been to facilities that projects didn't work, and we went back, and you're continuing to work with the groups, and that's fantastic. But it is completely demoralizing to see thousands of hours and years of work go into a project, and then it's like, yeah, it didn't work for X reason, and now we've mothballed all of it. And we still like you guys, and we're still going to work with you guys, but we just completely mothballed that, and we're going to go look for something else, anything else. And we fired the project manager. We've certainly been through several of those in which the project manager was no longer there, rightfully so. We've talked a bunch about the human side. We've talked about some projects. I want to talk a little bit about some of the future technology. So technology is continuing to advance. We've got artificial intelligence. We've got machine learning. We've got all of these tools that are probably going to drive technology forward at rapid speed. But it's also going to impact change management, right? And change management requirements, and it's probably going to push more need for change management and the understanding of the humanity part of this. how do you anticipate the future technology changes, and how do you anticipate the future technology changes in relation to change management as we move forward with manufacturing?
Yeah. I think there's a couple big pieces. I'm going to come back to the AI piece after, because that's a huge topic. We could talk for another 4 or 5 hours just on AI and change management there. But outside of AI, I think I've seen a trend, and I'm curious if you guys agree, over the last little bit, where the industry, the request for applications, operational applications or OT applications in manufacturing is shifting from maybe the traditional platform approach to a more modular operational platform, right, for OT, where rather than deploying an MES with 14 functions all at once, right, you're starting to carve this up and deploy more like modular microservice almost based deployments to solve specific use cases. And I think that is potentially, well, maybe first I'll ask, do you guys agree with that shift, maybe at a high level?
I think there's more applications available today than in the past, which lends itself, I guess, to less of a monolith, to maybe microservices as you're describing. But I'm not sure from an end user if that is more of a requirement or a need, right?
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, I could see that. I guess regardless, I think this shift, and we've seen all the big players in this space moving away from you buy our platform and we provide all of this functions bar none, right, to more of an a la carte option, let's say, where you can buy pieces of our software to solve specific use cases. And I think that shift is because of a few different things. One, it's a huge technical undertaking to deploy 14 different MES capabilities in a single platform all at once. Right, that is a monstrous undertaking from a technical standpoint. But two, it's also a monstrous undertaking from a change management standpoint. So you bring those together, and your chance of success is much lower. Plus, your costs are much higher. So for many reasons, they're moving towards this more use case specific offering or functionality. And I think that shift, as it continues, will also change the landscape of change management, where now the scope of change management is also becoming much smaller, where you're not impacting 25 workflows all at once. You're impacting 5 or 6 at most. And it really is just, I think, starting to increase the likelihood of success for a lot of these implementations, and allowing change management teams the best chance possible to be successful in their goals. So I think that's one piece, and I think as technology shifts more towards that direction, I think the change management or the methodologies used in change management will continue to shift as well. But going back to the AI piece, AI in change management is a whole other ballgame, because AI, if we talk about traditional AI like machine learning, deep learning, things like that, those are more systematic with mathematical statistical approaches to solving problems. So there is determinism in them, right? At least a measurable amount of determinism. But then we start talking about things like generative AI and chatbots and integrating agents into all of these different workflows, where determinism is not measurable. There's no confidence score. There's a higher level of difficulty with observability and traceability in the decisions that are being made. As those come in more and more into manufacturing, I think change management goes from managing an application to managing now an individual or a team of individuals, where the tactics and the strategies applied to managing generative AI implementations will be more like managing people, human resources, rather than applications. Because when it comes down to validation or qualification or certification, I think there is going to be a very similar approach, where you can no longer test that this application worked once. You have to continuously test it to ensure that it is not drifting or losing the capability to perform a function that it was intended to perform. And that is going to be a huge shift, I think, in manufacturing technology.
I would 100% agree with you, Logan, right? I would say, like, my main concern, and I think I've expressed this in a different conversation, right? But you've mentioned this point earlier in your story, where if the end customer or end user is experiencing any doubt in the system, they will immediately resent the system, the group, the project, and whatever else that's tied to it. So what I'm concerned with is that, of course, there's going to be groups that will be not necessarily more ambitious, right, but will sort of like pull the trigger prematurely before they have demonstrated the full capabilities and robustness of the application, will deploy and thus not only burn the bridge for themselves, but also create this, I don't want to say fear, right, but hesitancy to go with a different group that may have taken a little bit longer, but have proven themselves in the field of battle, so to speak, right? So, and we've seen these. I remember going as far back as 10 years ago, where there were, posts of industrial robots taken over by AI, killing humans in these like factories, which of course is a sensationalist title, right? But I'm really hoping that AI doesn't go or follow the same path, where a few bad apples will ultimately, again, poison the entire pool, so to speak. So I'm curious, I guess, like, how do you balance, or how do you see the future evolve as these solutions get deployed? I'm assuming that a lot of them will fail, but are you seeing maybe these successes slowly start trickling where end users are a little bit more open to those engagements, or is it the opposite? Are they getting a bit more hesitant because of some of the problems?
I think it's a little bit of both, honestly. I think the promised value of generative AI implementations in manufacturing is growing at an exponential rate, right? With the advancements of these models, they are smarter now than they ever have been, and they'll be smarter tomorrow than they are today. We'll continue to see that, that exponential increase in capability. But at the same time, as time goes on, you get more and more failed initiatives, and I think largely that's attributed to, almost every software company now is AI powered, right? There's chatbots and everything. There's AI agents doing work behind the scenes on all of these applications, or most of these applications now. But the challenge of making sure that those agents are successful in their responsibility and the function that they're meant to perform is often, I think, maybe not properly focused on in the sales process. So clients get sold on the hype of the potential that these provide, and not warned about the legwork that it takes to build up a proper foundation for them to actually be successful upon. And I saw somebody post on LinkedIn, and I wish I could remember their name, because they said it very elegantly that really resonated with me. And they said, AI doesn't make bad data worse. It makes it more convincing, which by nature is far worse, right? If you have convincing bad data that you may or may not understand is wrong until it's too late and you've already acted upon it, that is a very dangerous situation in manufacturing, or could be very dangerous or costly, right? And that is, I think, something that everybody really needs to put some emphasis on is, do we have the right foundation for AI adoption to be successful? And it doesn't have to be holistically across your enterprise, but for this specific use case that we are contemplating putting AI in to help augment or accelerate, is the foundation for that use case ready for that implementation? And if it's not, and you do it prematurely, you're going to get exactly what you said, Vlad, which is, you're going to get an untrustworthy response, and it's going to cause somebody a lot of headache, and that is going to be the end of that tool, right? And it'll be a while before they build up the courage to try again.
I like that. I like all of that. I like all of that. And I think, Logan, to your first point, talking about the monolithic engagements and these monolithic solutions versus more microservices, I haven't traditionally considered them as microservices. I would say, in my experience, especially in the last 7 to 10 years, I see more and more groups going and building things by phases, either to allow them to deliver sooner, in order to limit their overhead and exposure, in order to go attempt to build with one group and then determine if they want to continue with that group or not. And so I certainly see more and more of those. And on our side, as we are architecting solutions and building and deploying these solutions, we're certainly doing them in the fewest amount of sprints, and we're certainly doing them at the most rapid rate possible for all of what you're saying. I was reminded a number of years ago, I was deploying, I think it was a phase 2 of an MES solution at a fairly large Fortune 50, right? And as part of phase 2, we had to go completely rebuild phase 1 because it was done so poorly. It was impossible to go build phase 2 on top of phase 1, as they oft are, because we were not involved in the phase 1 build. Having said that, at some point, I had a tally, and Vlad has heard this story. I had determined that we were one of like 4 to 6 competing MES solutions across the enterprise, and they didn't know which is gonna win, right? Like they like legitimately didn't know, but they had 4 to 6 of these champions, so probably vice president plus, who are all championing the enterprise to go ahead and deliver these solutions, and they were kind of hedging that one of them was going to work. So that's almost the exact opposite of microservices, but I suppose if you're a Fortune 50, then $6-10 million versions of the same software are basically a bunch of microservices in order to see which one could possibly be successful and which ones could not be possibly successful. So I think it's interesting, and I imagine that we will see more of that into the future. Having said that, we get to go ask you the final questions we ask all of our guests, and the predict the future question is my favorite that I get to go ask our guests every week. So I want to ask you to go predict the future, and I would love if you could maybe continue down your thoughts on change management. So what does the future of change management look like in the industry in the next 2 to 3 years?
It could go any way. We could have AI-powered robots taking over the world in the sensationalist opinion of AI, but of course that's not going to happen. But I do think that as AI and other advanced technologies become more prevalent in the manufacturing space, there will be a fundamental shift to how change management happens. Obviously, AI will never replace the human component of anything we do in our day-to-day, right? But there are certain aspects of change management that I feel will be accelerated, augmented, or the frequency of a check-in or a touch point regarding the change management aspects of an implementation or across a facility as a whole will be augmented by agents through the workflow. And I think that will, I've never met a continuous improvement team or a change management team at a client that was not, at least 2 to 3 months behind where they should be, because they're a small team taking on way too much. And they're just drowning in things, right? And as soon as you fall behind in that world, it is really, really hard to get caught up. And sometimes you're not in near enough real time to catch problems before they become a severe problem or a catastrophic problem for the success of an initiative. So I think the more we can augment that and offload some of the less emotional components of change management, I think it'll be a huge shift to enable CI teams to get caught up and actually start thinking about what comes next, rather than what do we need to get caught up on, what fires are we still fighting.
I like that. I'm hopeful for that. At least that last part, I'm very hopeful. I am hopeful for that. Next question for you, Logan, is some career advice. So if someone was kind of earlier, maybe mid-career, what is one best piece of advice you can give them? Yeah.
I think I mentioned it earlier. The one piece I always give to everyone is don't think about the system. Don't think about the component. Think about the system as a whole. And that is applicable to any level at which you're focused on. If you're working on a VFD replacement, don't just think about the VFD. Think about the PLC that it integrates with. If you're working on a case packer replacement, don't think about the case packer. Think about the entire line and the area of the facility it works in. At least try to go 1 to 2 levels north and south of wherever you're working to understand the impacts that change will have outside of where you're actually, hands on keyboard.
I like it. I think we saw Vlad flinch when you said case packer. So you've hit close to home. Logan, you've got a couple of book recommendations for us. What do you have for us today, please?
I'll start with a boring one that I think you guys have probably gotten a lot, which is the goal. And I mean, great book, a little bit dated to be honest today, but I think it covers a lot of really, really good concepts if you're new to the, the optimization, continuous improvement, and change management spaces, right? So that's one. The other one, maybe something that you may not have been recommended yet. I'm curious to see. It's called Switch, How to Change When Change is Hard. I think it was authored back in like 2008 or 2009 or something like that. But it has a really, really cool metaphor that it follows through like the core messaging of the entire book. And it talks about, metaphor is basically there's a rider that rides an elephant through a path and navigates a path. And the different pieces, the rider represents the more analytical or rational part of the brain. The elephant represents the emotional part and the motivation part of the brain. And then the path is the environment in which you're navigating or impacting change within. And the whole kind of concept comes back to, you need to direct the rider, you need to motivate the elephant, and you need to shape the path. And thinking about all of those things when it comes to change, especially the emotional part. Remember, the emotional part in this book describes as it provides the energy and the motivation to actually impact a change. That is the key component. You need the right behavior, you need the right attitude, and you need the right motivation. You can't just think about it analytically. But those two things don't work without an easy path as well. So doing everything you can to shape the environment that you are impacting the change within as well is really important. So really, really good book. I would highly recommend it for people who want to understand maybe the more psychological components of change management.
No, I like that. The book name sounds very familiar. I don't remember Switch being a book that had been recommended in the past. So one, thank you for both books, Logan, but also thank you for coming up with a book that we have not had recommended that is in any way, shape, or form tangentially related. So that is good. Thank you for that. Next up, I'm going to ask you for like an interesting idea or innovation within our space. If you could come up with anything, where do you think lies opportunity? Is it change management? Is it something else?
I think maybe very related to the change management and maybe the more so the digital transformation kind of world that I live in. But if you were asked to design a dashboard 2 years ago, or a very elaborate scheme of dashboards, maybe 10, 15 screens that work together to provide some analytical output. If you wanted to make sure that aligned well with the customer's expectations, it's really, really hard to put that into a document and say, this is what this screen is going to do all in text, right? You almost always need some sort of visual or graphical portrayment of what this will look like in the end to garnish or solicit enough feedback from the client to say yay or nay. So 2 years ago, if we did that, we would likely have spent 2 or 3 weeks in Figma or Draw.io or even Visio or something, putting together a prototype. And then we would use that as the ability to review, to walk through the theoretical workflows with the client to get an approval. With the introduction of AI-assisted coding agents and this entire new world, prototyping has never been as fast as it is right now. So we have replaced internally with LSI. A lot of our prototyping now goes from, rather than designing Figma screens, although we still do some with AI-assisted and MCP integration with Figma, but developing full prototypes of applications using things like React, where you can, define the requirements and even simulate data sources. So you have, live data in the back end, and have a fully, near functional application that you can navigate through and drill down into and see pop-ups and all of these things with far, far more detail than we could in 2 weeks in Figma in, 2 days with this new approach. And what that does is it really shortens, you mentioned sprints earlier, right? So regardless if you're doing like a rapid application development framework or agile development framework, your periods of development, the timeline for that has collapsed drastically, right? You can get through a mock-up and a review cycle in 3 or 4 days that used to take 3 or 4 weeks. And that process really, really just reduces the risk of poor adoption and therefore poor change management post-implementation.
Absolutely. I am a big fan of those tools for that reason, in large part because I really didn't enjoy sitting in front of Figma or any of those tools, going up and trying to mock up a system out of my brain over the course of several weeks. So I'm very happy we can expedite the process of it and reduce the amount of brain time and increase the amount of compute time to get there. So I completely agree. Logan, last question for you. How can our listeners help? Who should reach out? Who are you looking to connect with? How can they help you with what you're doing at LSI?
Yeah, we're always looking for people who, LSI as a whole, who, love the automation space, right? And in the digital transformation group as well. If you like to kind of blend the line between operations and technology and that type of space, feel free. If you're looking for career advice, I'd be happy to have a conversation about change management or not about change management. Or operations leaders within clients, if they have struggled with implementing technology or digital solutions in the past and struggled to get the value out of them that they expected or deserve, feel free to reach out. We'd love to have a consult and talk through what maybe our approach, how that would look differently than the previous approaches you've tried. And if something resonates there, we can always take the conversation further.
Awesome. Logan, thank you so much for joining us. This has been an awesome conversation and a fantastic setup and primer, I suppose, for change management for all of our listeners. And thank you, everyone, on the listener side for going ahead and joining us. If you somehow aren't, please make sure you're connected with Logan on LinkedIn. You can certainly find him on LinkedIn talking about all sorts of things, not just change management. In fact, probably most things not inclusive of change management, regardless of how important that it is. Please make sure that you're connected with myself and Vlad and following Manufacturing Hub so you can listen to all of our new episodes. Next week, we've got Kobe and Carl from Inductive Automation, CEO and CTO, co-founders of Inductive Automation on. We're going to go explore a whole bunch of different topics, so make sure you're tuned into that. If you've made it this far on YouTube or podcast form, please hit the subscribe button, rate us 5 stars, and throw us a thumbs up like button, and all of those other fun things. When I ask, you guys do it, and then Vlad launches the podcast on Thursday morning, and more you guys listen to us, which is absolutely